Hi, my name is Devin. Today I'm going to do my presentation on agglutination and Asian languages. And before I get started, just a few things I want to go over. First of all, some vocabulary, morphology, studying morphemes, something we've covered in class already. Just to review, morphemes are the smallest discrete unit of meaning in a language, and they come in all kinds of different types. Some of the big ones are free versus bound morphemes. Free morphemes being words in isolation, whereas bound morphemes require another word to be attached to. And then there's derivational versus inflectional morphemes, which inflect the semantic or syntactic use of the word, respectively. And there are a few different types of morphology we see in Asian languages or languages in general. First, biggest group I want to go over is isolating or analytic, and these are two separate concepts, but they appear in conjunction so often that they're usually just grouped together. So isolating means there's a low morpheme per word ratio. So basically, it's a lot of free morphemes. It's usually either a single morpheme or a pair of morphemes are all that's needed to make a single word. And then analytic is a type of morphology which expresses grammatical relationships without inflectional morphemes. And biggest, best example that we've seen in class of this type of morphology is going to be Mandarin. Mandarin, as you can see on the slide, uses a lot of singular morphemes to express either syntactic or semantic ideas, but they usually occur by themselves and aren't. They don't change depending on the number or the tense or other features of the sentence, whereas something like Spanish, here as we can see fusional morphology, Spanish and a lot of Indo-European languages fall into the synthetic language category, and specifically the fusional category within synthetic. So a synthetic language or synthetic morphology refers to, it's the opposite of isolating in that it's a high morpheme per word ratio. So now something like Spanish, based on this example, we can see that for most of the words here, it's usually a single morpheme. But then we get to hablo, which has two morphemes. It's the root hablo, and then specific morpheme for that number and gender and person. So these types of languages are they're the languages you have to conjugate for those kind of things. All your Romance languages, Germanic languages, and basically a lot of Indo-European languages fall into this category. Then agglutinative is the one that we're going to be focusing on today. And agglutinative literally means gluing together morphemes. So the important distinction, because as we saw in fusional, they're also sort of gluing together the morpheme to create meaning, but the important thing to denote is that these morphemes are still separate from each other. They're not being affected by adjacent or any other morphemes that are in the word. They're isolated and they serve their own function without being affected by any of the other morphemes. And the other important distinction is that there is a low meaning to morpheme ratio. So each sort of type of information is conveyed with its own morpheme. Whereas in the previous example we saw for Spanish, there was a morpheme which that single morpheme denotes the number, the gender, the formality, the person. So there's a lot of meaning being contained in a single morpheme. So we'd say that has a high meaning per morpheme ratio, and it's the opposite case for agglutinative languages, which tend to, like I said, have a single function being served by each morpheme. And then Turkish is by far, we've talked about this previously, it is by far our best example of what an agglutinative language looks like. I mean, as you can see from the slide, there are, a dozen different morphemes all stacked together, and that's considered a single word, but you can see that it conveys all kinds of information. It's almost a clause in and of itself. And then this is another concept that I really want to go over, and that we have this tendency as linguists to take something like language, and there are a lot of patterns in language, and language tends to be regular to an extent. So it's easy for us to look at these separate categories and group languages into those categories. But what we find is that language is an organic thing. It doesn't always fit the rules. So one of the things I wanted to go over was that despite the fact that we tend to apply these labels to languages, morphology types are not 100% mutually exclusive. One of the problems with trying to categorize language is that it tends to be a lot more messy than we give it credit for. It'd be really convenient to just say there's one kind of morphology for each language, but like I said, that's not the case. Germanic languages tend to be listed as fusional languages, but anybody who studied German can tell you that they love to glue together words, and that's not 100% the same thing as agglutination, but like the example, Crossworträtsel is crossword puzzle, so they're taking whole words and gluing them together, and this is something that German does a lot of. Any sort of technical vocabulary is just words upon words upon words, all just glued together into this single huge words. And English also does that a lot, especially with words from Germanic roots. Good example of that is unwholesomeness. You can break that down into unwholesomeness, and these are each separate morphemes that are all being glued together to create a brand new word with a lot more inflected meaning than each of its individual parts. But then on kind of the opposite hand, a lot of the Greek and Latin roots, those are the ones that form the really, really big famous examples, like anti-disestablishmentarianism. Those are all Greek and Latin words, or roots rather, that can glue together, and you can see each step it glues a morpheme onto the original word, and it sort of step by step distinguishes the meaning from the last step. And the biggest difference between this and what we traditionally describe as agglutinative languages is that these agglutinative structures tend to be more semantic than syntactic in their function, whereas that's generally what we mean when we refer to an agglutinative language, is that these morphemes are being bound together and serving, although there definitely are morphemes within agglutinative languages which affect semantic difference word to word, usually it tends to be more of a grammatical focus. And here's some of the examples we used in class. Like I said, Turkish, that's our best example, Korean, Tamil, Burmese, and then sort of the oddball is Japanese, which this is another messy one where it and Korean both superficially very, very agglutinative, but there's a little bit more to it than that. We'll get into that in a minute. There's also, besides the ones we focused on in Asia, there are a lot of other agglutinative language scattered throughout the world, like Finnish and Hungarian and Basque. And some common features we've seen in the agglutinative languages we've studied so far. Not much common phonologically, that's to be expected since this is a focus of grammar more than phonetics. So basically, yeah, not a whole lot in common there. There's some necessary extrapolation you make from having an agglutinative language, like case marking, for example, because they're defined by being a synthetic language. They don't use inflectional morphology, so they need some other way to designate cases. Like in Japanese and Korean, we see these distinct particles. Turkish uses morphemes, which are bound within each word. The other thing, they tend to be head final, and this leads to some of our other common features, subject, object, verb, sentence construction, postpositions rather than prepositions. Something I couldn't find in my research, why there's this link between head final and agglutination. Yeah, there's just, it's one of those things, it's not something we really 100% know the answer to, but it's just something that happens to reoccur throughout these languages. So here we're going to look at Turkish. Building off the last point, we have this example of Turkish. Now, to English speakers, this is somewhat confusing because as we can see through the translation we're looking at, the successful, that root is buried deep within the clause. And as English speakers, that's kind of counterintuitive to the way we structure our language. Or from the Turkish perspective, putting the object of discussion first immediately clues you into the focus of the sentence. So whereas the subject tends to be, it's because we're used to focusing, we're a head initial language, whereas they're a head final language. So yeah, putting the subject of the sentence, the subject of this clause, deep in the middle of the translation, because that's the English version, it doesn't make sense to us, but from Turkish perspective, that's the first thing you see, so that sort of sets the tone for the clause, so you know exactly what's being discussed and what's being expressed about that object from the successive morphemes that build onto the root. As far as Tamil, I couldn't find a whole lot about a lot of detail about Tamil agglutination, other than the fact that it uses a very straightforward arrangement. It's pretty similar to Turkish. One thing I did find about Tamil is that it's the only agglutinative language I was able to find that lacks a copula. And here's Korean, specifically the verb morphology. There's a system of slots for morphological affixes which occur in a very specific sequence. And that's something we see in a lot of these languages, that you can't just, there's a very specific order. You have to agglutinate things in. You can't just throw in, the affixes where they fit. They've got a very specific, they need to occur in this order for them to be grammatically correct. And now, here's our Japanese. Like I said, there's some debate about, because it's got features which make it look agglutinative, but it's also got features which make it kind of look like an isolating language. It's got some features that make it look kind of like a fusional language. So overall, the most consistent morphology I've seen is that it does tend to follow an agglutinative pattern. Like as you can see, we've got this example which goes step by step and changes the meaning of what's being expressed in that clause dramatically. One big thing to note is that, as I've highlighted in red here, there are some phonological changes. So as we discussed earlier, like in Turkish, we saw those morphemes exist entirely distinct. There's very rigid, this is this morpheme, this is that morpheme, and they don't affect each other. Whereas what we see in Japanese is that there is a sort of phonological shift that occurs to make it flow a little bit better in terms of speaking. And that's not typical. That's not something we usually see with agglutinative languages, so that's an immediate red flag. Morpheme per word ratio is definitely not as high. Like we saw in Turkish, you can stack so many morphemes onto the same root, and it still works as a cohesive unit. Whereas Japanese, you can stack a couple. Like in the example, we've got like 4 morphemes all sitting together in a single word unit, but it's not as high as Turkish or some of the other languages we can see. But this is really what I was referring to previously, in that we like to categorize, and like most sources will tell you, oh yeah, Japanese is an agglutinative language. It does a really consistent job of stacking morphemes on the end of verbs to make new and different clauses, but realistically we see it's a little bit more complicated than that. So that pretty much does it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation.